Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into something history books barely whisper about. Not knights, not castles, not kings or queens, but what life was really like for women when their monthly bleeding arrived in medieval Europe. Forget scented bath salts, forget tampons and pads. Those didn't exist. Instead, picture damp cottages, soiled straw mattresses, rags reused until they stank of rot, and women working in fields while blood ran freely down their legs. This was daily life, hidden in silence, dismissed as shameful, and often downright disgusting. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It blows my mind seeing this little circle of voices stretching across the globe. Now dim your lights, settle into that blanket, maybe let the hum of a fan cover the silence, because we're about to walk into one of history's dirtiest secrets. Congratulations. You've just woken up as a medieval woman, somewhere in a thatched hut at the edge of a muddy village. The first thing you notice isn't the rooster crowing outside. It's the wet, sticky feeling between your legs. There are no pads waiting in the corner, no neat tampons wrapped in paper. Just the same rag you used last month, stiff brown and sour smelling from being rinsed in cold water and hung by the fire. It's damp because it never dried properly, and when you press it against yourself, it scratches like sandpaper. Most women had nothing better. They cut strips from old tunics or bedsheets, stuffed them between their thighs, and hoped the blood wouldn't seep through. Some poorer women didn't even have rags. They stuffed moss, hay, or animal wool inside their skirts. Imagine pulling moss from a damp forest floor, shoving it against your body, and calling it protection. By the end of the day, it was soaked, clotted, and crawling with bacteria. Many didn't even bother. They bled directly into their clothes, staining long wool skirts that reeked of iron and sweat. Privacy didn't exist. You bled in one-room homes, surrounded by family, neighbours and animals. A goat or pig snuffled in the corner while you squatted over a chamber pot. There was no toilet paper, just your hands, the rag, and maybe cold water if you lived near a stream. Soap was rare and expensive, so was firewood for boiling cloth. Most rags were simply rinsed in a bucket, then reused, stiff with crusted blood. Doctors of the time wrote about women's filth with disgust, but they never bothered to imagine what it meant to sit all day in clothes that stank of blood and mildew. And the shame was constant. If a stain spread on your skirt, neighbours noticed. If a smell leaked through your layers, people laughed or whispered. Some believed menstrual blood could spoil crops, sicken children, even rust iron. A woman on her period was treated as dangerous, unclean and cursed. The church sometimes barred her from touching holy objects or entering sacred spaces. And yet, she still had to milk cows, bake bread, carry water, and serve her husband, even as cramps twisted her belly and blood soaked through her only dress. The truth? Menstrual hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't just primitive. It was humiliating, unsanitary, and brutal. Women lived through cycles of pain and shame, while the world around them pretended it wasn't happening at all. History remembers kings and knights, but half the population spent every month dealing with a reality too dirty, too shameful for anyone to write down. When you picture menstrual hygiene, you probably think of something sterile, wrapped in plastic, pulled fresh from a box. Medieval women would have laughed bitterly at that thought. Their options weren't clean, weren't comfortable, and often weren't even safe. What they used was whatever they could scavenge, and much of it made their lives far dirtier. The most common solution was simple cloth. Not soft cotton, but old scraps torn from worn-out tunics, bedding, or aprons. These rags were folded and wedged between the thighs, then rinsed and reused. But rinsing meant dunking them in cold, dirty water, the same bucket used to wash dishes or clothes. Soap was scarce, firewood too precious for boiling. That meant the rags rarely got fully clean. They stiffened with dried blood, smelled sour, and rubbed the skin raw. Women carried them under layers of wool skirts, sweating in summer heat until the cloths turned into breeding grounds for infection. Vaginal sores, rashes, even festering wounds weren't uncommon, but no one spoke about them. For poorer women, cloth was a luxury. In rural villages, moss pulled from forest floors was stuffed into underwear or simply pressed against the body. Imagine squatting in the dirt, picking damp moss that still carried insects, earth and rot, then holding that against your most sensitive skin. It soaked up blood for an hour or two, then turned soggy, dripping into skirts. Some women mixed moss with hay or straw, which poked and scratched. By the day's end, the mixture smelled like a barnyard, and often it was one. Animals and humans shared the same straw bedding, and women bled directly into it at night, waking in sticky clumps of blood and manure. In some regions, sheep's wool was used, soft at first, but impossible to wash properly. After a few rinses, it hardened, carrying not just blood but bacteria. Fleas and lice, already everywhere in medieval homes, burrowed into these makeshift pads. Using them was like wrapping yourself in a damp, crawling sponge. And here's the part that polite history ignores. Sometimes women didn't use anything at all. They simply bled into their clothes, into long wool dresses and undergarments. Stains were obvious, the smell impossible to hide. Imagine walking through a marketplace, praying that blood doesn't seep down your legs while neighbours pretend not to notice. For women who worked in fields, there was no time to stop. Blood mingled with sweat, mud and manure. Their skirts became heavy with it, drying stiff in the sun, only to be reworn the next day. Reusing cloths brought another horror: infections. Without sterilisation, women regularly suffered from abscesses, fevers, or what we might now call toxic shock-like symptoms. They had no idea why their bellies swelled or why pain twisted their insides after a period. Some died of mysterious fevers that were really septic infections caused by rotting rags. The shame around menstruation meant this suffering stayed invisible. Husbands, priests, and even doctors dismissed it as women's filth, and so women suffered in silence, clutching their stained rags, hoping no one could smell them, and praying they'd survive another cycle. The truth? Medieval menstrual materials weren't solutions. They were punishments in fabric and moss. Every month, women dragged themselves through days of itching, burning and bleeding, knowing there was no better option. For many medieval women, menstrual hygiene was a luxury they could never dream of. Rags, moss, even wool, those required access to cloth scraps, forests or sheep. The poorest women, who worked as servants, beggars or labourers, often had nothing at all. When their periods came, they simply bled into their clothes and prayed it wouldn't show. Picture this: a woman in a wool tunic she's owned for years. It's the only one she has. The fabric is rough, already stained with dirt and smoke. When her period arrives, she doesn't have a stash of cloths hidden away. She just pulls her dress tighter and keeps working. The blood runs down her thighs, soaking into the wool, leaving dark stains that stiffen as they dry. By the end of the day, her clothes reek of iron and sweat. There is no spare dress to change into. Tomorrow she'll wear the same one again, still crusted from the day before. Beds offered no escape. In one-room cottages, whole families slept together on piles of straw, sometimes with livestock nearby. A bleeding woman would curl up beside her children, knowing that by morning the straw would be sticky and foul. Blood clots, mixed with dirt and animal droppings, turned the bedding into something no one dared touch. But there was no choice. Fresh straw wasn't easy to gather every week. Most families simply added more on top, layering filth over filth, until the smell of rotting straw and menstrual blood hung in the air like a curse. For the homeless and the destitute, the shame was even greater. Women who begged on city streets had no place to hide. When their bleeding came, they squatted in alleys, leaving red streaks on cobblestones. Medieval city streets were already full of dung, urine, and garbage, but menstrual blood added another layer to the stench. Priests wrote angrily about women soiling the stones of holy towns, but these women had no choice. They lived their cycles in public view, mocked as dirty, cursed as sinful. And then there were the consequences. Poor women rarely survived infections from contaminated cloths because they didn't even have cloths to begin with. Their bodies were exposed constantly, bleeding into clothes that weren't washed for weeks. Lice thrived in the damp warmth. Ulcers formed where wool rubbed against bloodied skin. Many women carried low fevers for years, never healing, their health eaten away by conditions no man cared to notice. The shame of poverty made things worse. Blood stains marked you instantly as poor. Wealthier women could at least disguise their cycles with layers of linen, perfumed oils, or a quick retreat into private spaces. But the poor had nowhere to hide. Their skirts told everyone when they bled, and gossip travelled fast. Neighbours whispered, men laughed, and priests warned that women, unclean from menstruation, should stay away from markets, wells and churches. Yet those were the very places poor women had to go to survive. So every month, poverty turned bleeding into a public humiliation. Not just a private misery, but a mark on your body and clothes that said, you were poor, you were filthy, and your suffering didn't matter. The truth, for the poorest medieval women, menstruation wasn't a cycle to be managed. It was a cycle of degradation, endured openly, in front of families, neighbours and strangers, who all pretended not to see, while quietly recoiling from the smell. In the medieval world, blood was everywhere. Battlefield wounds, butchered animals, medical bleedings. But menstrual blood, that was something else. The church insisted it was different. Unclean, dangerous, even demonic. Priests preached that women's bleeding was a mark of Eve's curse, punishment passed down from the fall of man. Every drop was a reminder that women were weak, sinful, and forever stained by original sin. That meant menstruating women weren't just messy, they were spiritually polluted. Some regions banned women from stepping into churches during their cycles. Others forbade them from touching holy water, kissing the cross, or even baking the Eucharist bread. The fear was simple. One touch from a bleeding woman could defile the sacred. This terror bled into everyday life. Families believed a menstruating woman could spoil food just by looking at it. Bread wouldn't rise, beer would sour, milk would curdle, gardens wilted, iron rusted, animals fell sick. Husbands accused wives of witchcraft if crops failed during their cycles. And neighbours whispered that menstrual blood was the ingredient witches smeared on broomsticks for flight. A superstition so strong it persisted for centuries. The irony? Menstrual blood was feared as dangerous, yet it was also secretly valued as a powerful medicine or charm. Apothecaries recorded recipes where dried menstrual blood was fed to epileptics or smeared on wounds to stop bleeding. Some whispered that drinking it could bind a man in eternal love. A witch's brew whispered in alleys and kitchens. Men might recoil from menstruating women publicly. Yet they sought out midwives and healers who used the very substance they called filth. And superstition bled into medicine. Medieval doctors, trained in the theories of Galen and Hippocrates, claimed women bled each month because their bodies were too moist, too soft, too weak to burn off excess humours. Men with their hotter and stronger constitutions sweated out waste, while women leaked it in blood. If a woman missed her period, it was seen as dangerous. Stagnant blood could rot inside her, leading to madness, suffocation, or even death. Treatments ranged from herbs that induce bleeding to, unbelievably, leeches placed directly on the vulva. Imagine lying on your straw bed while a physician, probably a man who'd never seen a naked woman outside the sick room, instructed you to spread your legs while he pressed squirming leeches against your flesh. The pain, the itching, the slow oozing of blood, all in the name of balance. No one cared that women fainted, screamed or bled uncontrollably. To the doctors, this was science. To the women, it was torture disguised as medicine. The church's teachings also shaped sex. Men were warned against touching their wives during menstruation, lest they be poisoned by the blood. Some bishops declared children conceived during this time would be born deformed, cursed, or even possessed. Yet, just like with food and medicine, these taboos were often broken in the shadows. Husbands ignored warnings, prostitutes carried on business regardless of the cycle, and women endured the double weight of secrecy and shame. So every month women were reminded their bodies weren't just inconvenient, they were dangerous. They carried pollution strong enough to ruin crops, sour beer, and offend God himself. The truth, menstrual blood in medieval Europe, wasn't only a bodily function. It was a spiritual sentence, a mark of sin that followed women everywhere they went, from the bedchamber to the marketplace, from the kitchen to the church door. Forget the sanitized myths of medieval life. To live in a world without plumbing, without soap, without privacy, meant that blood wasn't something you discreetly managed. It was something everyone could see and smell. The stench hit first. Rags reused for weeks, moss-packed damp, wool never boiled, all of it fermented against the body. By the second or third day of bleeding, women carried with them a heavy, sour odour of iron, sweat and rot. In cramped villages or crowded towns, there was no way to hide it. Imagine kneeling in a church pew, praying silently, while the neighbour beside you shifted uncomfortably, covering her nose with her sleeve. Whispered prayers turned into whispered insults. Unclean, cursed, rotten. Stains made the shame visible. A poor woman bent over in the fields could feel the warm spread of blood soaking her skirts, then drying stiff against her thighs. When she stood up, there was no hiding the dark marks that had seeped through wool. In marketplaces, women bargained for bread, while red streaks dripped down their calves. Children laughed, men jeered, women averted their eyes but gossiped the moment she left. One ruined dress could mark a woman for months as dirty, shameless, or even possessed. And because medieval homes were shared, one room for an entire family, privacy was impossible. A girl on her first period often bled in front of parents, siblings, even grandparents. Beds made of straw betrayed her instantly, the clots leaving sticky black patches that everyone could see. Brothers mocked, fathers scolded, mothers hissed at daughters to hide it better. Shame began early, hammered in at home, reinforced by church and echoed in the streets. The humiliation wasn't just social, it was legal too. Some towns banned menstruating women from handling bread sold in markets, or barred them from drawing water from communal wells. If you were caught bleeding openly, Your neighbours might accuse you of witchcraft or of bringing disease. Think of it. A bodily function used as evidence in trials that could end in exile or worse. Wealthier women tried to disguise the shame with perfumes, rose oil, myrrh, lavender. They dripped it onto cloths or smeared it on thighs to mask the scent. But perfume was expensive, and all it really did was mix sweetness with the sour tang of blood, creating a new, nauseating odour. Sometimes husbands provided oils not out of kindness, but out of disgust, demanding their wives cover the stench of sin if they wanted to remain in bed beside them. For prostitutes, the shame was amplified tenfold. Clients sneered if they suspected bleeding, and brothel keepers fined women caught working while menstruating. But money was money, and women often had no choice but to keep working, even when the blood betrayed them. For them, every stain, every odour wasn't just embarrassment. It was lost income, punishment, even beatings. What's clear is that menstruation wasn't just an inconvenience in medieval times. It was a social brand. A reminder that women's bodies were judged constantly, mercilessly, and publicly. Every smell and every stain wasn't just evidence of bleeding. It was proof, in the eyes of neighbours and priests, of women's inherent filth. The truth? Menstruation in the medieval world was never private. It was a public spectacle of shame, seen and smelled by everyone around you, and it followed you whether you were rich, poor, saint or sinner. If you think medieval menstrual medicine offered women relief, think again. Most treatments made things worse, painful, humiliating, and often deadly. Doctors, still leaning on ancient texts from Hippocrates and Galen, believed women bled monthly because their bodies were weak, cold, and unable to burn off excess humours. Men sweated their waste, they said, but women leaked it out in blood. That meant if a woman didn't bleed, she was considered dangerously sick. Her body stagnant with poison. So what did they do? They tried to force the bleeding. Midwives and physicians prescribed herbs to loosen the womb: pennyroyal, rue, and savin. These weren't harmless teas, they were toxic, abortifacients. Women desperate to restore their cycles drank bitter concoctions that burned their throats and wrecked their stomachs. Some succeeded, many died. And when herbs failed, doctors reached for leeches. Yes, leeches. They pressed the wriggling things against a woman's vulva, believing the bloodsuckers would draw out bad humours. The agony wasn't just physical, it was humiliating. Imagine lying on a straw pallet, legs spread, while a man in robes held a jar of squirming worms, then pressed them against your most intimate skin. They latched on, bit down, and fed. Blood oozed, mixed with saliva, leaving raw wounds that often became infected. Some women fainted from the pain, others bled for hours. When leeches weren't enough, they tried scarification, deliberate cuts around the thighs, groin, or even directly on the labia. The idea was to release trapped blood and restore balance, but rusty knives and unwashed hands turned these sessions into breeding grounds for infection. Women left the procedure feverish, trembling, sometimes never recovering. Doctors also recommended bizarre rituals. A woman with blocked menses might be told to sit over a steaming pot of boiled herbs, letting the vapours rise into her body. Picture her crouching over hot, foul-smelling steam, thighs burning, while neighbours whispered outside the door. Others were told to carry amulets of dried animal organs, fox livers, hare wombs, tied against their bellies to draw out the blood. None of it worked, but it gave men the illusion of control over women's bodies. And when bleeding was heavy, the treatments were no better. Doctors warned that too much menstrual blood would drain a woman's life force. Their cures ranged from cold compresses of mud and dung applied directly between the legs, to potions of ashes, wine, and vinegar forced down throats. Women desperate to stop the flow endured remedies that burned their insides or poisoned their livers. The church added another layer of misery. Priests claimed heavy bleeding was punishment for sin. Women who confessed to lust, adultery, or even envy were told their bodies poured blood as God's judgment. The cure, then, wasn't medicine at all. It was prayer, fasting, and penance. Imagine crawling on your knees through a cold stone church, dripping blood as you begged forgiveness, while the priest muttered that your womb was a reminder of Eve's betrayal. What made it worse was the silence. Women didn't speak openly about their suffering. Mothers whispered remedies to daughters. Sisters passed secrets in kitchens. Midwives learned by experience. But in public everyone pretended menstruation was unspeakable. And so women endured the pain in silence, subjected to leeches, knives and poisonous herbs, because no one dared say, "This is cruel, this is wrong, this is killing us." The truth. Medieval medicine didn't ease menstrual suffering. It turned women's bodies into battlegrounds for superstition, experiments and punishment, leaving scars, infections and graves in its wake. In the medieval imagination, menstrual blood was never neutral. It was never just blood. Instead, it carried power, terrifying, intoxicating, and unpredictable. Depending on who you asked, it could kill a man or cure him, ruin a harvest or bind a lover forever. Doctors recorded some of these beliefs in their manuscripts. They wrote that menstrual blood was dangerous to crops, claiming that if a bleeding woman walked through a field, the wheat would shrivel, grapes would rot, and bees would abandon their hives. Smiths swore iron tools rusted faster if touched by a menstruating woman, and bakers whispered that dough kneaded by bloody hands would never rise. Fear turned normal women into walking curses. But in the shadows of kitchens, taverns and brothels, the very same blood became a tool. Midwives and cunning women knew it could be used for charms and remedies. A few drops of dried blood crumbled into wine was said to cure epilepsy. Smeared on animal wounds, it supposedly stopped bleeding. Some whispered it could even prevent leprosy, though whether it worked or simply horrified the disease away is another matter. Then there were the darker uses. Men believed menstrual blood in food or drink could enslave them to a woman's love. There are stories, whispered, never written in church records, of wives stirring their blood into husband's ale, or prostitutes smearing it on their lips before a kiss, binding clients with a lust they couldn't shake. One medieval love manual even warned men to beware of women's wine, because blood of their secret parts may be therein. But if menstrual blood was powerful in love, it was terrifying in magic. Witch trials centuries later were full of accusations that women smeared menstrual blood on broomsticks to fly, or used it to summon demons. In Italy, some believed witches painted doors with it to curse families inside. Others claimed if a menstruating woman stared too long at a child, the child would sicken, and if she touched wine, it would turn to vinegar. These weren't quaint superstitions. They were accusations that could end with a woman burned at the stake, and medicine often blurred into magic. Learned doctors might dismiss old wives' tricks, but behind closed doors they sometimes prescribed remedies that relied on menstrual blood. A 14th century text suggested mixing it with honey to treat eye infections. Another recommended soaking it into wool and binding it to aching joints. Even physicians who condemned menstruating women as unclean quietly recorded recipes using their blood. Imagine the double life of medieval women. in public shamed as filthy, accused of spoiling food and rusting metal, in private sought out by neighbours who whispered, "Give me some of your cloths, my husband is ill." Women's bodies were condemned, yet their blood was stolen, hidden, consumed. And beneath it all ran the fear of exposure. To admit using menstrual blood in medicine or charms was to risk being branded a witch. So remedies were passed in whispers, scribbled in margins, buried in oral tradition. It was a paradox. The most despised substance of the female body was also the most coveted. The truth? Menstrual blood in the medieval world was never just a nuisance. It was a paradoxical fluid, shunned in daylight, traded in shadows. To some it was poison, to others it was medicine, to many it was magic. But above all, it was power, and that power terrified men. For a medieval girl, the first period was less about growing into womanhood and more about being shoved into a world of judgment, superstition, and expectation. There was no gentle explanation, no pamphlets, no quiet reassurance. It came suddenly, with pain, blood, and humiliation. Imagine a girl of 12 or 13 living in a one-room house with her family. She wakes in the straw bedding to find her legs sticky and the sheets dark with blood. Panic sets in. She doesn't know if she's wounded, dying, or cursed. Her cries draw the attention of siblings and parents, who see the stain before she even understands it herself. In an instant, her childhood is over. Mothers, if present, might offer whispered instruction: how to bind rags between the legs, how to clean cloths in cold water, how to carry herself without showing the pain. But the advice came laced with warnings. Don't let the neighbours see. Don't let a man touch you now. Don't bleed in church. Don't spoil the bread. Every lesson was fear. Every whisper a reminder that her body was a source of danger and disgust. And the community noticed. Once a girl bled, she was seen as fertile, and therefore eligible for marriage. In some towns, girls were married off within months of their first cycle, no matter if they were only 12 or 13. Their blood wasn't a private change, but a signal, as obvious as a marketplace announcement. This body is now a womb, ready to be used. First periods also drew darker reactions. Medieval superstition held that menstrual blood was cursed. Neighbours whispered that a girl's first bleed was especially dangerous, brimming with the most potent filth. Some said crops would wither if she entered the fields, or animals would sicken if she touched them. Girls were sometimes forbidden to milk cows or prepare food during those first cycles, leaving them isolated and ashamed. The physical reality made it worse. Early cycles were often irregular and heavy, and the crude rags available did little to help. Blood soaked through skirts, left trails on legs and stained beds. A young girl had no practice at hiding it, and every slip brought ridicule. Imagine walking in the village square, feeling warmth spreading under your tunic, only to hear the snickers of boys pointing at the back of your dress. The church added its own weight. Priests preached that women's bleeding was Eve's curse, proof of sin carried in the female body. A girl at her first period was sometimes barred from communion, forced to sit apart in church, her shame displayed in front of her entire village. For many, the memory of that first public exclusion lingered longer than the blood itself. Yet within this misery, there were also secret networks of women. Older sisters or aunts might slip a girl bits of advice, or share softer cloths when they had them. Midwives sometimes marked the occasion with private counsel, warning the girl of the dangers of men, or hinting at herbs that might ease cramps. These whispers were lifelines in a world otherwise deaf to girls' suffering. The first period in medieval life was a brutal awakening. It didn't mark freedom or independence. It marked surveillance, shame, and the looming threat of marriage or accusation. It was less a celebration of life than a warning. Your body is no longer yours. The truth, to bleed for the first time in the Middle Ages, wasn't just a biological event. It was a public sentence, written in red, declaring a girl both woman and outcast in the same breath. If the home was suffocating for menstruating women, the outside world could be downright cruel. Medieval society didn't just expect women to hide their bleeding. It built rules, gossip, and rituals to make sure they couldn't forget their unclean state no matter where they went. Work was the first battleground. Many women laboured in fields, spinning rooms or kitchens where bloodstains were almost impossible to hide. Rags slipped, skirts clung. Without soap, cloths held the iron stink of blood even after washing. Fellow workers noticed, and whispers followed. Men joked about red women, spoiling the day's bread or ruining the harvest. Some households even forbade women from baking, brewing, or milking animals during their periods. Terrified, the food would sour, or the cows would run dry. Imagine standing in the corner of your own kitchen, hands idle, as others worked, all because of something you couldn't stop. The church magnified the shame. Menstruating women were often barred from communion, sometimes from entering the church at all. Priests quoted Leviticus to remind them they were unclean, and sermons thundered that bleeding women carried sin in their very bodies. Some parishes made them confess specifically for lying with their husbands in their courses, whether they had or not. A young girl in her first cycle could be marched to confession for no reason but biology, her secret dragged into the open. And then came the community rituals of humiliation. In smaller villages, everyone knew who was on her courses. Laundry lines gave it away, the telltale cloths drying in the wind. Boys mocked them, men laughed, and even older women joined in, calling the younger ones careless or dirty. For some, menstruation became a recurring spectacle. Every month proof of their unclean state fluttered in public view. Markets were no refuge. Merchants sometimes refused to sell to menstruating women, claiming their touch cursed produce or spoiled meat. One tale from rural France told of a menstruating woman who brushed against a barrel of wine. By morning, the wine had turned sour. Whether coincidence or rumour, the story spread, and women learned to stay silent or send others to shop for them when they bled. And of course there was the physical humiliation. With only rags, moss or grass for protection, leaks were inevitable. Women left stains on benches, pews or even market stalls. Once discovered, these spots became evidence of failure, pointed out and mocked. For many, the fear of staining was worse than the blood itself. The dread of being branded dirty in front of the entire community. But alongside the cruelty, there was a strange double standard. Men publicly shamed women for bleeding, but privately believed that menstrual blood carried dangerous power. Some avoided sitting near a menstruating woman, fearing her presence could wither crops. Others accused them of souring butter, killing bees, or turning wine to vinegar just by breathing near it. Women were both mocked and feared, ridiculed as weak and cursed as dangerous. The paradox meant one thing: menstruating women could never escape scrutiny. At home they were judged by husbands, in church by priests, at work by fellow labourers, and in public by neighbours. Their blood marked them, month after month, as both less than human and more than human, polluted yet powerful, disgusting yet terrifying. The truth? In medieval society, periods weren't private. They were public property, picked apart by gossip, sermons, and superstition. A woman couldn't just bleed, she had to carry the weight of everyone else's disgust and fear, all while pretending nothing was wrong. If there's one detail medieval writers never stopped repeating about menstruating women, it was the smell. To them, bleeding wasn't just a private mess, it was a public offence, a stench that announced itself before a woman even entered the room. And in truth, without soap, plumbing, or reliable cloths, odour was unavoidable. Cloth rags, once soaked, were rinsed in cold water and left to dry, but they rarely came clean. They carried a sour, iron tang that never washed out. Women reused them again and again, the stench growing sharper with each cycle. Imagine pulling on a cloth stiff with old stains, knowing its smell would follow you all day. The smell clung to clothes too. Linen shifts, worn under tunics, absorbed blood, and without frequent washing, which risked ruining fabric, stains and odour built up. Bedding was worse. In one-room homes, a family might share straw mattresses, which quickly turned into reeking sponges of sweat, urine, and menstrual blood. For neighbours, the smell was proof of poverty. For husbands, it was a weapon. Complaints of a wife's stench could be used as insults or excuses to beat her. Worse still, medieval medicine turned odour into dogma. Physicians claimed menstrual blood was rotting matter, expelled from the body to prevent poisoning. Texts warned that its smell was inherently corrupting. Some even argued that if a dog sniffed a menstruating woman's blood, it would go mad. Others believed crops withered or wine soured if exposed to her odour. Superstition gave ordinary stench the weight of cosmic doom, and women knew it. The anxiety of being smelled out was constant. Some tried to mask it by burning herbs, stuffing sprigs of rosemary or lavender into bodices. In wealthier homes, women perfumed themselves with rose water. But for the poor, there was no cover. They lived with the dread of someone wrinkling their nose, stepping back, or muttering a word like feta, stench under their breath. Even in church, women couldn't escape it. Priests lectured that the smell of menstruation offended God himself. Some churches forbade bleeding women from entering during Mass, not just because of blood, but because their odour was thought to pollute holy space. Imagine standing outside, barred from worship, while everyone else filed in, the shame radiating off your skin like a second scent. The smell also became a metaphor. Medieval poets and satirists used menstruation as shorthand for filth, corruption, and decay. They described women as stench bearers, their cycles proof that female bodies were closer to rot than to holiness. These insults weren't hidden. They were shouted, sung, and carved into graffiti, reminders that women's natural bodies were treated as jokes. But perhaps the cruelest part was how odour followed women, even when they weren't bleeding. The cycle of shame meant that any unpleasant smell, sweat, dirt, sickness, could be blamed on menstruation. A woman who smelled of hard labour might be accused of being on her courses, whether she was or not. Her body became a walking cloud of suspicion, her dignity forever tied to imagined stench. The truth? In the medieval world, menstruation wasn't just a hidden pain, it was a public stink. And that stink wasn't only real from cloths and beds and sweat, it was symbolic, exaggerated by priests, physicians and neighbours into proof that women's bodies were fundamentally foul. To bleed was to carry a mark you could never wash off, no matter how hard you tried. To the medieval mind, menstruation wasn't just dirty, it was deadly. Physicians, priests, and ordinary villagers alike believed menstrual blood carried toxins so potent it could rot fruit, rust iron, and kill life itself. It wasn't metaphorical corruption. They thought it was a literal physical poison flowing out of women every month. The origins of this belief went back to antiquity. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder claimed a menstruating woman could sour wine simply by looking at it, dull razors by touching them, and wither crops by brushing against them. The Middle Ages swallowed these ideas whole and added darker layers. Monks copied these facts into encyclopedias, repeating them as if they were scripture. Doctors lectured that menstrual blood was corrupted humours, expelled to keep women alive. If it stayed inside too long, they said, it poisoned the womb and spread madness. But if it left the body, they insisted, the danger spread to everything else. Stories told of bees dropping dead if a menstruating woman passed near their hives. Bakers swore dough refused to rise if touched by unclean hands. Farmers avoided letting bleeding women walk through fields, fearing their crops would wilt. In some regions, women were warned not to touch mirrors, convinced their reflection during a period would tarnish the glass. And people believed it. Imagine the crushing paranoia of knowing your very body was blamed for a spoiled meal, a sick cow, or a failed harvest. If the butter curdled or a barrel of ale soured, whispers might follow you. Was she bleeding? A woman's cycle became a scapegoat for nearly every household misfortune. The myths grew even darker. Some medical texts warned men never to have sex during menstruation, claiming it bred monsters. They described children born from such unions as deformed, hairy, or animal-like, hybrids between human and beast. Others claimed that if a man swallowed even a trace of menstrual blood, willingly or not, he would go mad or drop dead. These warnings created a twisted paradox. The same men who feared menstrual blood sometimes sought it out, secretly, as a supposed ingredient in potions of love, fertility, or revenge. Because here's the irony. Alongside the terror, menstrual blood was also believed to carry mystical power. In folk magic, it was mixed into food or wine as a love charm. Some women smeared it on doorways to ward off evil, while others whispered it into men's drinks to bind their affection. For the poor and powerless, using what society hated most about them became a form of survival. But if discovered, the punishment was brutal. A woman caught using her own blood for magic could be branded a witch, dragged before neighbours, and even executed. The stigma of poison clung hardest to widows and unmarried women. If a man sickened or livestock died near them, their cycles became instant evidence of guilt. Rumours of blood curses spread quickly in villages, turning natural biology into grounds for persecution. Many accused witches, in fact, were described not only as old or childless, but also as women whose bodies bled corruption. The truth? Medieval society turned menstruation into a paradox, both feared and coveted, shunned as filth, but stolen for sorcery. Menstrual blood wasn't seen as neutral. It was a force of destruction, death, and dangerous power. For women, this meant their cycles weren't just humiliating, they were potentially fatal, a monthly mark that could be twisted into an accusation of poisoning, witchcraft, or worse. To bleed in the Middle Ages wasn't just to suffer, it was to live under constant suspicion that your body carried a weapon you could never put down. Few moments in a medieval girl's life were more terrifying than her first period. It wasn't celebrated as a sign of maturity. It wasn't quietly explained by her mother with reassurance. More often, it was a shock that brought fear, shame, and the crushing weight of society's judgment. Imagine being 12 or 13, suddenly waking up to a blood-soaked shift. There were no guides, no soft conversations, no pamphlets hidden in a school bag. Many girls thought they were dying. Mothers, if present, might whisper a warning, but even they carried centuries of shame. They told their daughters to hide it, to wash in secret, to avoid men and priests. This wasn't about celebration, it was about survival. From that first cycle, the girl's body became public property. Everyone around her suddenly read her differently. Neighbours gossiped that she was now ready for marriage, even if she was barely more than a child. Her father saw her as a bargaining chip, a body capable of bearing children and sealing alliances. To men in the village, her bleeding wasn't a private biological change. It was a signal that she was no longer a child. But the stigma was immediate too. Priests warned that girls became spiritually dangerous once they bled. Some churches even forced first-time menstruating girls to undergo purification rites, standing in front of the congregation as though they had sinned. Imagine the humiliation. A trembling child, red-faced, forced to atone for the simple facts that her body had begun to work as nature intended. The myths about first blood were cruel and contradictory. Some said that the first flow contained the worst poison, that it could kill crops, sicken livestock, or drive men insane. A few texts even claimed that if a girl's first blood fell on the ground, the earth itself became barren. Others spun darker tales, that demons were especially drawn to first blood, sniffing out young girls like wolves. Mothers might tell their daughters to burn the cloths, to bury them far from home, to keep the blood from evil eyes. At the same time, that blood could be fetishized. Folk healers whispered that a drop of first menstruation could be used in spells to bind a lover forever, or to guarantee fertility. In some twisted sense, a girl's vulnerability was turned into someone else's tool. Her most frightening, confusing moment became a commodity for others to exploit. The community, of course, never let her forget. Boys teased, older women scolded, men glanced differently. In crowded houses, where everyone shared sleeping spaces, there was no privacy. A girl couldn't even hide her cycle from siblings or cousins. Every stain, every rag on the wash line, every whispered confession was noticed. And once noticed, it marked her. That first bleed became a cage. From then on, she was expected to work harder to keep herself clean, to manage the impossible task of concealing the unconcealable. She was expected to guard her body, to avoid temptation, to never let her danger spill into the community. Failure wasn't just embarrassing, it could brand her as a witch, a temptress, or a source of divine punishment. The truth, puberty in the Middle Ages wasn't the start of womanhood, it was the start of scrutiny. First blood didn't just mean fertility, it meant danger, stigma, and the loss of whatever fragile innocence a girl was allowed to have. From the moment the first drop fell, her body stopped being hers. It belonged to her family, her church, and her community, and she would carry that burden every month for the rest of her life. If menstruation was dirty, dangerous, and corrupting, then why do so many medieval texts also link it with desire? Because for all their horror, men couldn't ignore it. They feared it, mocked it, and yet, in whispers, they wanted it. Medical writers thundered against sex during menstruation, calling it unnatural, corrupt, even demonic. They claimed children conceived this way would be born twisted, hairy, or monstrous. But the very fact they kept writing about it, page after page, betrays a fascination. Priests stood in pulpits warning men never to touch their wives during their cycle, but confessionals were full of whispered admissions that some men did exactly that. Sin was seductive precisely because it was forbidden. Among the poor, survival often erased taboos. A prostitute couldn't afford to turn down clients just because she was bleeding. Some men, in fact, sought it out, believing the blood heightened lust or made the encounter more intense. Others whispered that sleeping with a bleeding woman gave them power, or worse, that it cleansed them of illness. Of course, the reality was much filthier. Shared rags, stained bedding, and an infection risk no one understood. Yet the demand was there, hidden under the cloak of silence. Folklore tangled blood with love spells. Women were rumoured to slip a few drops of their menstrual blood into wine to bind a man's desire. Husbands accused their wives of witchcraft if they grew too affectionate, as if the only explanation for loyalty or lust was blood magic. And sometimes the rumours were true. Poor women, desperate for control in a world that stripped them of it, did use their own blood in food or drink. To men it was disgusting. To women it was survival. Even the church couldn't keep its distance. Medieval sermons often described menstruation as proof of female corruption, but they lingered on the imagery with almost pornographic relish. Priests railed about filthy red rivers and demonic bleeding, turning women's bodies into grotesque spectacles of lust and punishment. The line between condemnation and obsession blurred. For women themselves, the contradiction was unbearable. On one hand, they were told they were unclean, untouchable, disgusting. On the other, men crept into their beds despite the warnings, craving what they publicly condemned. A bleeding woman was both shunned and desired, feared and fetishized. Her cycle was supposed to make her invisible, yet it drew eyes all the same. And this wasn't just a problem for prostitutes or poor women. Even queens and noble women weren't spared. Behind palace walls, rumours spread about rulers' wives, that they seduced men with their blood, that their lust was insatiable during their courses. Court gossip weaponised menstruation, transforming natural biology into scandalous evidence of debauchery. No woman, no matter her rank, could escape the double standard. The truth, in medieval Europe, menstruation was the ultimate taboo. But like all taboos, it was also the ultimate temptation. Men condemned it in public and consumed it in private. Women were trapped in the middle, their bodies twisted into symbols of lust and shame, their blood turned into both poison and aphrodisiac. To live with a cycle was to live in contradiction, condemned as disgusting, desired as forbidden, and never allowed to be simply human. Officially, the rules were simple: no sex during menstruation. The church thundered against it. Medical texts warned of monstrous children, and moralists painted it as one of the worst sins of lust. But life never fits neatly into rules, especially not in crowded medieval homes, where privacy didn't exist. Marriages were practical contracts, and desire refused to stick to the calendar. So people invented loopholes. Some couples simply ignored the prohibition, but many took the subtler route, creating excuses for breaking it. If a man couldn't resist, he might convince himself his wife was near the end of her bleeding and therefore safe. Others claimed that if the flow was light, it didn't count, as though God graded sin by volume. In confessions, priests often heard elaborate justifications. She had already washed, I didn't realise, or it was too dark to see. These rationalisations became a medieval script for getting away with what everyone insisted was forbidden. For women, the challenge was greater. A husband demanding sex couldn't easily be refused without risk of anger, suspicion, or even violence. Some women tried avoidance, sleeping apart or pretending to be sick. Others used their cycles as shields, stretching them out beyond reality, a convenient excuse to escape a husband's advances. But that too was dangerous. A man could accuse his wife of lying, or worse, of deliberately using her bleeding to deny him his marital rights. The church itself created a bizarre set of calendar rules around menstruation. Not only were women barred from sex, but they were also restricted from entering churches, touching sacred objects, or even baking communion bread. Yet priests knew well that people bent these rules constantly. A woman might sneak into mass anyway, or a baker might quietly ignore the unclean prohibition if she was the only one available to knead dough. Enforcement was spotty because life required bending the very laws it preached. Doctors, too, offered strange advice to justify desire. Some suggested that mild intercourse during menstruation could actually help cleanse the womb more thoroughly, a medical excuse tailor-made for men unwilling to wait. Others insisted that abstinence for a full week was unhealthy, that pent-up seed could poison the body, and so health became the fig leaf for lust. Prostitutes had their own workarounds. Since many couldn't afford to lose income for several days each month, they employed tricks to mask menstruation, stuffing rags higher, washing more frequently, even using herbal mixtures to slow the bleeding. Some clients knew and didn't care, others were fooled. But in reality, everyone in the trade understood that no sex while bleeding was more wishful thinking than reality. The hypocrisy didn't stop there. Men who raged about impurity from the pulpit often slipped into confessionals the next day, admitting they had broken the very rules they demanded others follow. But priests rarely gave harsh penance. A few prayers, a fast, or a coin slipped into the poor box. That was enough to absolve a sin the church itself had described as monstrous. Lust might be dangerous, but money and repentance always smoothed it over. And then there was the silence. The greatest workaround wasn't excuses or tricks. It was pretending the problem didn't exist. Communities looked the other way, families ignored what they knew, and couples quietly navigated cycles without ever saying the word menstruation. The silence itself became the cover, the excuse that let everyone pretend their rules were kept, while reality told another story. The truth? Medieval people didn't stop desiring just because priests told them to. They didn't stop having sex just because blood was present. They just learned to lie, bend, and invent ways to keep lust alive, while pretending they were obeying. Rules gave them guilt, but life gave them workarounds. If menstrual blood was taboo in the village, imagine what it meant in a convent, a place dedicated to purity, chastity, and constant prayer. Behind stone walls, dozens, sometimes hundreds of women lived together, sharing dormitories, eating at the same tables, kneeling in the same chapel. Their bodies may have been shut off from men, but not from the cycles that came every month. And the truth is, convents reeked of it. Nuns were not supposed to speak openly about bleeding. Silence was a rule of many orders, and the subject itself was so taboo that to bring it up directly was considered scandalous. That meant practical matters like cloths, washing, disposal had to be handled discreetly, often passed down from older nuns to novices in hushed whispers. There were no written guides, no official church instructions. It was as if the female body didn't exist, but it did. And in crowded dormitories, there was no hiding it. Straw mattresses stained, cloth rags hung discreetly in wash basins, and the smell clung to the air. Imagine dozens of women bleeding in cycles that often synced from constant communal living, with only rough linens or moss-packed cloths to absorb the flow. Infection was rampant, itching and sores were common, and yet none of it could be admitted aloud. Confessionals made it worse. Nuns were required to confess even the smallest sins. But what about the accidents they couldn't control? Leaks during prayer, soiled habits, stains on chapel benches. Some confessors treated these accidents as moral failings, demanding harsh penances for what was simply biology. A woman could be made to fast, to kneel for hours, even to lash herself for impurity. In some cases, abbesses used menstrual shame as a form of control, punishing young nuns for carelessness in a cycle that was never their choice. There are darker whispers too. In some convents, servants were tasked with handling the washing of bloodied cloths. Those women often left accounts, stunned by how much blood they had to scrub from the habits of supposedly holy women. To the outside world, nuns were symbols of chastity. Inside, their bodies betrayed them every month, leaving visible proof of the very thing the church wanted forgotten, that women, even in cloisters, bled. And yet, the blood could also be twisted into piety. Hagiographies, stories of saints, occasionally turned menstruation into metaphor. A nun's bleeding might be described as a holy wound, a mark of Christ's suffering. One legend even claimed that a saint's flow of blood was miraculously transformed into the scent of roses, erasing the stink of the body with divine perfume. It was a way of rewriting reality, hiding the filth of the cloister under the poetry of miracles. But the reality wasn't roses. It was rank cloths drying in cold chambers, women passing rags in secret, novices crying as they stained their habits for the first time. It was discipline disguised as purity, penance demanded for stains no one could prevent. It was endless silence, where even the natural rhythm of the body was treated as shame. The convent walls kept outsiders from seeing, but if you stepped into a cloister during menstruation, you wouldn't find angelic voices rising without distraction. You'd find women shifting uncomfortably on hard benches, habits stiff with dried blood, and a shared knowledge that no prayer could erase the weight of their own bodies. When the church said menstruation was punishment for Eve's sin, they weren't exaggerating. Every cramp, every gush, every infection was framed as divine justice. But women still had to live through it, and medieval medicine, a volatile mix of superstition, bloodletting and herb lore, tried to offer cures. Most were useless, some were deadly. Doctors, who were almost always men, viewed menstruation as the body's way of purging excess humours. If the blood didn't flow regularly, they panicked. A woman with a missed period was thought to be poisoned by her own body, filling up with bad blood that might drive her insane. The standard cure? More bleeding. Imagine already weak from loss of blood, only to have a physician cut open a vein in your arm or ankle to balance your body. Women staggered home pale and shaking, still menstruating, with a second wound to care for. Other remedies were herbal, but no less brutal. Recipes for regulating menstruation included pennyroyal, savin, or tansy, herbs known even then to be violent purgatives. Taken in large doses, they caused vomiting, diarrhea, and sometimes organ failure. But women were desperate, and the instructions were whispered from midwives, neighbours, or even prostitutes who had learned them through hard necessity. Many died trying to bring on or stop their bleeding. And then there were the folk remedies that sound absurd until you realise they were often the only options. Some women tied bundles of herbs to their thighs, hoping the smell alone would draw down the blood. Others sat over steaming cauldrons of boiling plants, primitive vaginal steams, inhaling toxic fumes, while sweat poured down their bodies. Some inserted mixtures of wine, honey, or animal fat into the vagina. thinking it would soothe irritation. Instead, it caused infections that could linger for years. The most grotesque cures came from male physicians obsessed with control. A popular belief held that sex itself could unblock a woman's cycle, forcing her body into balance. So if a woman's period didn't come, doctors sometimes recommended intercourse, even for nuns or widows. In other words, therapy meant being pressured into sex. It wasn't healing, it was abuse dressed up as medicine. Poorer women, meanwhile, often had no doctor to call. They turned to midwives and healers, who worked in shadows, outside the church's blessing. These women carried secret knowledge, some of it practical, much of it dangerous, recipes involving ground-up animal parts, ashes mixed with wine, even menstrual blood itself fed back to the patient as a charm against future suffering. The line between medicine and magic blurred, and women, caught in the middle, risked their health with every sip. Of course, none of these cures address the real problems: malnutrition, filth, constant pregnancy, and infections. Heavy bleeding might come from untreated fibroids, irregular cycles from starvation, horrific cramps from pelvic infections. But medieval medicine didn't know bacteria, didn't know hormones. All they knew was humours, balance, and punishment. And so the treatments often made women worse, bleeding them dry, poisoning them with herbs, or shaming them into silence. For some, the only cure was endurance. They gritted their teeth, used whatever rags they could find, and prayed. Others died young, worn out by endless cycles of blood, childbirth, and infection. Remedies promised relief, but more often they brought more suffering. In medieval Europe, menstruation was never just a private pain. It was a battlefield, with the body on one side, superstition on the other, and women caught in the middle, paying the price for cures that cured nothing. If bleeding in private was painful, bleeding in public was disastrous. Medieval society wrapped menstruation in layers of taboo, but those layers cracked easily when neighbours noticed stains, smells, or absences. What should have been a simple fact of biology became fodder for gossip, ridicule, and even suspicion of witchcraft. A woman who bled heavily couldn't always hide it. Her rags leaked, her tunic darkened, and sometimes the smell gave her away. Imagine standing in a market stall selling eggs or cheese, only to feel the sudden warmth spreading between your thighs. No modern pads, no emergency change of clothes. Everyone around you could see, and silence wasn't guaranteed. Laughter, whispers, even cruel taunts followed. It marked you as dirty, weak, or cursed. Children mocked women too. Young boys were known to jeer at washerwomen scrubbing bloodstains from cloths in the river, yelling about their unclean rags. For girls just entering puberty, these humiliations were terrifying. A single public accident could brand them as the butt of village jokes for months, if not years. Inside families, menstruation wasn't treated kindly either. Husbands often accused wives of laziness when they avoided work during their cycle, ignoring the pain of cramps or dizziness from blood loss. Mothers-in-law sneered at new brides who bled heavily, saying it made them unfit for bearing strong children. Some women even faced beatings for soiling shared bedding. Instead of sympathy, the monthly cycle was used as proof of a woman's supposed frailty. Religious stigma added another layer of shame. Women known to be menstruating were often told to stay away from church, lest they pollute the holy space. That meant sitting at home while the entire community gathered, a glaring absence that everyone noticed. Neighbours speculated aloud. She must be bleeding. Gossip grew like wildfire. A woman's body was no longer private. Her cycle was discussed across the village, as if it were public property. Worse still, menstruation sometimes became an excuse for accusations of witchcraft. Blood that refused to flow was seen as a dangerous build-up of impure humours. Women with irregular cycles were whispered about as having unnatural powers. If their bleeding was heavy or erratic, neighbours muttered that they were cursed. And if livestock suddenly sickened or crops failed, the menstruating woman could easily be blamed. She must have used her blood for spells, they said. Menstrual blood was feared as a substance of hidden power, and women paid the price for that fear. Even among women themselves, stigma thrived. In tightly knit villages, menstrual gossip spread like wildfire. Who had stained her dress at the feast? Who had bled through her sheets on her wedding night? Who was suspected of hiding her unclean days to stay close to her husband? These whispers weren't harmless. They eroded reputations, poisoned friendships, and left women constantly on guard. Silence was often the only defence. Women learned to deny, to pretend, to scrub their rags in secret under cover of night. Some buried their blood-soaked cloths rather than risk being seen washing them. Others carried herbs meant to mask the smell, terrified that a single whiff would betray them. Entire strategies of concealment grew up around a natural process, because discovery meant humiliation. The cruel irony is that everyone knew. Every woman bled, every man with a wife or daughter understood it happened. And yet the very normality of it was erased, hidden, made into shame. It was the perfect double bind, something universal, treated as unspeakable. And so menstruation, more than almost any other aspect of medieval womanhood, became a scarlet mark of stigma, one that no woman could escape. If you think stigma was bad, the superstitions were worse. In medieval Europe, menstrual blood wasn't just seen as unclean. It was thought to be dangerous, almost magical. To men, it was a liquid that could kill crops, blight fields, sicken animals, and even rot metal. To women, it was both a curse and, secretly, a tool of power. Let's start with poison. Medical texts of the time claimed that if a menstruating woman so much as touched a fruit tree, the tree would wither. If she walked through a vineyard, the grapes would sour on the vine. Farmers believed her gaze alone could dry out fields of wheat. And heaven forbid she milked a cow. People swore the animal would stop producing milk entirely, or worse, the milk would turn bloody. It sounds absurd, but to medieval villagers, it was deadly serious. Animals, too, were said to be at risk. If a menstruating woman stroked a puppy, it might grow sickly. If she brushed a horse, the beast could stumble and die. Chickens handled by a bleeding woman were rumoured to stop laying eggs. Superstition spread through every corner of rural life, turning the natural cycle of half the population into a constant source of fear and paranoia. Then there was metal. Blacksmiths swore that menstrual blood could rust iron overnight. Knights believed it could weaken swords and corrode armour. One story told of a smith whose forge collapsed after a woman, on her unclean days, passed through his workshop. The link between menstruation and destruction was so strong that some men wouldn't even allow their wives to step near tools or weapons during their cycles. But the most unsettling beliefs revolved around men themselves. It was said that if a menstruating woman touched a man, she could sap his strength. If she touched his food or wine, she could make him impotent. Some even believed that menstrual blood could cause madness, that a single drop slipped into a man's drink would drive him insane. Whether or not women ever actually used this fear to their advantage, the belief itself reveals the deep anxiety men felt about women's bodies. Of course, superstition also gave menstrual blood a darker, more occult reputation. Witch trials brimmed with accusations that women used their periods in magic. People claimed witches painted spells with their blood, mixed it into potions, or smeared it on doors to curse households. Some midwives were suspected of saving menstrual rags, using them in fertility charms, or binding them to animals to steal their strength. None of this was ever proven, but the very thought made menstrual blood a substance of terror. And yet, in whispered corners, women themselves passed on different stories. Menstrual blood, they said, could be used to bind a lover, slip a few drops into his wine, and he'd never stray, hide a stained cloth under his pillow, and his desire would stay fixed on you alone. Was it true? Maybe not. But when you live in a world that gives you no power, sometimes even belief in secret power is a form of survival. The irony was brutal. A woman's cycle was condemned as a curse, a punishment, a danger to the very fabric of life. And yet the same blood was feared as powerful, mystical, a hidden force men could neither understand nor control. It was both the filthiest thing in the village, and paradoxically, the most potent. To medieval minds, this monthly blood was never just blood. It was a weapon, a poison, a curse, a reminder that beneath the silence and shame, women carried something men couldn't tame. So after all the rags, the moss, the hay, the gossip, the stench, the superstitions, and the endless bleeding, what can we actually say about menstrual life in the Middle Ages? One word fits best: silence. A silence so thick it has lasted centuries. Women bled constantly, but they weren't allowed to speak about it. Men turned their monthly cycles into objects of ridicule, shame, or suspicion. The church wrapped the process in language of impurity. Neighbours whispered, gossiped, and mocked. Even among women themselves, there was secrecy. Daughters whispered to mothers, sisters whispered to sisters, but no one dared speak too loudly. The cycle was universal, but it was also invisible. And yet, in that silence, women endured. They washed their rags in secret. They buried stained cloths under the soil. They whispered recipes for herbs to control pain. They passed along strategies for surviving public accidents. They stitched together networks of support even as society condemned them. What medieval records leave us is a picture shaped mostly by men, monks, priests, physicians. But behind those male voices, a hidden world of women's survival strategies thrived. It's tempting to laugh now at the medieval myths. The idea that a bleeding woman could sour wine, kill crops, rust iron, or render a man impotent. But behind the absurdity is something darker: fear. Fear of a body that men couldn't control. Fear of a process that happened without their permission. And so, fear turned into stigma. Stigma turned into rules, and rules turned into centuries of shame. The most tragic part? That silence didn't really end with the Middle Ages. Even in modern times, menstrual shame lingers. The whispers, the jokes, the sense of embarrassment. Women still carry bags discreetly, still face humiliation over stains, still hear myths about weakness and impurity. The medieval world didn't invent those ideas, but it cemented them in ways that echo today. And yet, there's another truth hidden under the dirt. Medieval women survived. They survived bleeding in drafty huts, in crowded castles, in convents and city slums. They survived childbirth after childbirth, miscarriage after miscarriage. They survived gossip, witch hunts, hunger and disease. Their resilience is written not in parchment, but in the very fact that we're here now. They endured, and life continued. Picture one of those women for a moment. A peasant in a smoky cottage, crouched by the fire, rinsing a blood-soaked rag in a pot of water, while her children sleep nearby. She sighs, exhausted, knowing the cycle will come again next month and the month after that. She knows she will never escape it, except perhaps in death. Yet she keeps going. Not because she's celebrated, not because anyone cares, but because survival has no other option. That is the real story of medieval menstrual hygiene. Not the church rules, not the doctor's nonsense, not the men's fear. The story is the women themselves, the quiet, gritty endurance of lives soaked in blood, hidden from history books, buried under shame. We can laugh at the myths, recoil at the filth, shudder at the cruelty, but we should also recognise the strength it took to live through it. Every single person alive today is here because some medieval woman endured that silence, that dirt, that pain, long enough to give life to the next generation. So next time you think about the Middle Ages as knights, castles and feasts, remember the blood. Remember the rags in the river, the gossip in the streets, the endless cycle that marked half the population. Remember the women who bore it in silence, because in the end, the truth isn't just disgusting, it's human, and it's still with us. For medieval women, menstruation wasn't an isolated inconvenience. It was only one link in a long punishing chain of blood that stretched across their entire lives. From the first period at puberty to the last drop before menopause, blood ruled everything. And when it wasn't menstrual blood, it was childbirth blood, or miscarriage blood, or the blood of an infection that no one could treat. The average medieval woman spent most of her adult years pregnant, breastfeeding or bleeding. In poorer families, girls could be married as young as 12 or 13. Their bodies weren't ready, but that didn't matter. Once her first period arrived, she was considered fit for childbearing. The same rags she used for her monthly flow soon doubled as makeshift birthing cloths. The transition from menstruation to childbirth was immediate and brutal. Childbirth was a nightmare of its own. No antiseptics, no anaesthesia, no trained doctors for most women. Midwives did what they could, but labour often dragged on for days. Blood soaked through straw bedding, through tunics, through anything that could be salvaged. Women screamed, fainted, and sometimes died before the baby even arrived. One estimate suggests that up to 1 in 3 women might die from complications of pregnancy or birth in the Middle Ages. For many, the flow of menstrual blood simply shifted into the flow of birthing blood, and sometimes into the blood of death. Miscarriages were common too. Malnutrition, disease, and hard labour wrecked women's bodies. When a miscarriage happened, it was often indistinguishable from a particularly heavy, agonising period. There were no sanitary pads to absorb the flow, no proper medical care to stop infection. Women bled at home, hunched over buckets or crouched in fields, while family members muttered about God's punishment. Some miscarriages were deliberate. Herbs like pennyroyal or tansy were taken to induce abortion. They worked, but often at the cost of the woman's own life, leaving her bleeding out in silence. Then came the churching rituals, where a woman had to be ritually purified after childbirth before she could return to the community. The underlying belief was that she was polluted, dirty, unclean from the blood of birth, no matter that she had risked her life to bring a child into the world. Her body was still treated as tainted, in need of cleansing. The shame wrapped around menstruation spread seamlessly to childbirth. What this meant was that a medieval woman rarely knew a year without bleeding. Periods until marriage, bleeding from childbirth, months of breastfeeding that might delay menstruation, only to be followed by another pregnancy. If she lived long enough, menopause might eventually bring relief. But most didn't. Many women never reached the age of 40, their bodies worn down by constant cycles of loss and strain. The connection between menstruation, childbirth, and death was inescapable. Every month was a reminder of potential pregnancy. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death, and every death in childbirth was whispered about with dread by the women who survived. They bled into rags, into straw, into the earth itself, often with no recognition, no dignity, and no escape. The men who wrote medieval medical texts described women as weak, unstable, governed by their bleeding. But the truth? Women endured more blood in a single lifetime than most men ever saw. Men bled in war, in rare bursts of violence. Women bled every month, every year, until the body gave out. It wasn't just hygiene that was medieval. It was life itself, a cycle of blood without end.